For the last several weeks, we've talked a lot about very realistic trade targets, but you know what? For the Jets, sometimes it's nice to dream a little bigger. Let's chat about the craziest ideas you could have on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we are dedicating to the dreamers, those who like to fantasize about top-end players wearing Winnipeg Jets navy and white. Now, obviously, some of these trades are going to be pretty fantastical, but I've identified a couple of teams that I think have some players that may be more attainable than it first appears for one reason or another. That doesn't mean that the Jets may be the ones to attain them, but they're going to be perhaps rumored options for trade deadline moves, maybe big blockbusters, maybe some players who are falling out of favor, or something is wrong with the team. And I think what I'm looking at, when it comes to potentially a dreamlike scenario for the Jets, there's a kid out there for the New York Rangers who, for some reason, just after signing a brand new contract, is already being rumored as part of some mega deal for Trevor Zegras. And that, of course, is Alexis Lafreniere. Obviously, Lafreniere is, very, very good. Last year, or maybe it was the season before, he was one of the Rangers' best players. And Lafreniere is, he's got the pedigree of being a lottery pick, one of the most talented players to have ever come through the QMJHL. And while his numbers in the Q maybe haven't translated to the NHL, you're getting a 23-year-old monster winger who truly has the difference, the ability to be a difference maker. And he's coming in at a very affordable cap hit. After this season, his contract starts at $7.45 million per season, and he's signed for a good long while. So Lafreniere, would be a player for the present and the future. And the thing with Lafreniere that always stands out is he's such a creative, really fun player to watch. I think he's one of the smartest wingers on the Rangers. Great passing, great vision, super gifted when it comes to puck control and very good scoring rates. There's a lot in his game that is just super fun, and I continue to think that he is, for the Rangers, one of their more talented players and somebody who, is a little bit underappreciated. I didn't think that was really possible to say, but I feel like, for a Rangers team that doesn't have, a tremendous offensive output and loads of elite skill to work with like it used to, this guy is one of your best players. But because the Rangers are kind of in this situation where they're looking for a big change, they're potentially thinking about shaking things up, they might be willing to make him available. Now, I don't know quite how this would all work, but the Jets and Rangers have been trade partners before. It wouldn't be the first time. We had the Trouba trade a few years ago. There's a strong relationship and a real pipeline between these two teams, and I wonder if that comes into play again. The Jets have talked about chasing megafish, although I don't know that this is the tier of megafish they've been referring to. They said players who are maybe not available currently, or at least have been rumored to be available. And I think Lafreniere is one of the more extreme ends of the target spectrum, right? You're talking about a guy who so far, in his best year put up roughly fringe second line numbers. But I think if you look under the surface and look at, his actual performance relative to ice time and kind of what he's been doing with the Rangers, there's a lot to like in his scoring profile. He has interesting rate metrics. Last year, he was really good. This year, he's a little bit off the scoring pace compared to last season, but I don't know that that's something I would necessarily worry about. This is a guy who I think is going to be a fantastic player for you somebody who I'm very excited about if he were to come to the Jets. Every time he's on the ice, his line is usually driving shot share by a pretty significant margin. His line relative to some of his teammates, he's got a 10% Corsi for shot share, which is pretty nuts. 10% is a lot, right? 56 to 58% shot share, at even strength is a big deal. And I think for, the Rangers, this is a team that quite frankly needs a bit of a shakeup. And apologies, it's actually more like 54%. It's 58% all situations, 54% at 5-on-5. Last year it was 8% Corsi for relative. So, obviously it's not the be all end all, but I think shot share is a really important predictor, usually of future success. And for Lafreniere, being on a dominant unit and really driving part of the kid line, I think can only mean good things if you're the Jets and you're looking for a winger who's crafty, skilled, and might be, the eventual heir to Nikolai Ehlers. Ehlers obviously has a little bit more in the transition side of things and has been one of the most elite 5v5 creators. I don't know that Lafreniere is quite there yet, but there are signs that he's continuing to grow. I think this season I'm sort of writing off for a lot of the Rangers. I don't know that I would read too much into what appear to be, modest scoring rates this season. I think if you get him out of there in the same way that you get him out of, you got Kakko to the Kraken, Lafreniere might really shine on a team like the Jets, where his ability to attack between the faceoff circles, to drive that slot area, and to create loads of chaos down low. He's a super gifted scorer, very smart player. And, on a season where he's having a little bit of a down PDO rating, a little bit unlucky, I think that there's a lot to like in his profile, and I would be all for going for him. Now, what it'll cost the Jets, a small fortune, right? You better be willing to back up the Brinks truck, relatively speaking, in assets. This is where like a Perfetti probably comes into play. Players of that caliber, Lambert, Salamonson maybe is in the conversation. But the thing with the Rangers is that they're probably looking for more roster player types, right? And if you're trading Lafreniere, who's got tons of team control for the foreseeable future, you're going to have to get a haul. And that's kind of where I feel like the price is just a little beyond what Winnipeg can afford. They don't have the ability to move, a massive package for a young termed player. It's not that they couldn't. I just don't think that Winnipeg, compared to some of the other teams that might be competing here, I don't know if they're going to have the same equivalence in value. That's why the Zegras package is a little strange to me. Zegras is a good player, don't get me wrong, but I feel like if you're looking for, an even swap, he doesn't really do it for me. I think the Ducks would have to give quite a few futures, and it'd be a massive package one way or another. If you're trading Lafreniere, you better be darn sure that what you're getting in return is actually halfway decent. He'll be the best player in the trade by a pretty fair margin, so the parts that you get back, you're really having to bank on having a bright future, and that's where I just don't know that the Rangers are really going to win any sort of deal. If I'm the Rangers, I wouldn't really be shopping Lafreniere right now. That's just my personal opinion. I know that they'll feel differently about things, and with how their locker room has been, maybe they're looking for a big shakeup. But if you're trying to trade one of your star young players who can be, a big contributor for the foreseeable future and is already signed at a very good contract value, do you really feel the need to start moving him? I know that his trade protection hasn't quite kicked in yet, but I wouldn't do that if I were you. You've got a couple of years to figure it out. I think his modified NTC doesn't kick in until the 28-29 season. So you've got a few years with him, and it gives you some flexibility. You're not really in a rush to move him. I don't think his value in trade stuff right now is as high as it could be, but they could still get a pretty nice package and maybe something that's bigger than what the Jets can afford. But if I'm talking dream scenarios and a team that Winnipeg has pretty strong relationships with recently, the Rangers might be an interesting port of call. And if they go to New York, I'd be curious to know how they do their shopping there. But with the JT Miller trade, I would assume that that's kind of like the Rangers indicating that they're not really looking to sell here. I think that they've been pretty clear that they think that they can try and salvage the situation. And there's been some signs that things have turned around. So an interesting situation to watch. That team is very chaotic and has a lot going on. If I'm Winnipeg, I'm just keeping a close eye. I wouldn't really imagine that this year is where the Lafreniere trade comes into play. But say the Rangers crash out early, summer is a big shakeup time. Maybe he becomes available sometime in the next couple of seasons. So something to keep an eye on and monitor. But at least for the meantime, it still remains pretty firmly in what I would call the dreamlike territory. But hey, you never know. Things could be fun in the future. But of course, that's not the only dreamlike trade I'm thinking about. The Blues have a couple of guys that are of interest. Maybe not on the same level in some ways as in Mikko Rantanen, but if you're talking about Jordan Kyrou and of course Robert Thomas, you've got two really, really good players, both of whom are signed to very fair contracts and who could honestly become really important players in Winnipeg's top six. Guys who have, great play driving ability, are top end scorers for the most part. And given that they are signed for the foreseeable future on very good contracts and offer great value down the middle or out wide, wherever you want to play them, you would be hard-pressed to not have some interest in that. But we'll chat about what that might entail in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, I did want to tell you about our friends at Wonderful Pistachios. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better-for-you unsaturated fats to help keep you full, feeling for longer, which is great, right? You often get hungry in the afternoons. You want a snack that feels filling without necessarily filling your caloric or fat intake. Wonderful Pistachios are here to help, and you can get them in a no-shells variety or a shelled variety. I personally like the shells. I think it adds a little bit more of a tactile feel, but if you just want some convenient fuel, the no-shell option is always great. You can pop them in before you head out for a quick run or maybe a trip. It always comes in small servings, very easy to take on the go, and of course, they are loaded with tons of protein that contain all 9 essential amino acids. So get snackin' and get crackin' with a snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about what I would consider to be, the dream-like trades and really big fantasy scenarios. Winnipeg is in an interesting position where I think that they've probably told Hellebuck and Scheifele they'll go all in to make a big cup run. Last year felt kind of in that vein of movement, but maybe didn't feel like it could, went as far as it possibly could. The Jets now have an impetus to really try and make something big happen. And I wonder if they go back to the Blues. The Blues, we did that Stastny deal in 2017, 2018. I was just talking about how I felt like, the Jets and the Rangers had a relationship. St. Louis and Winnipeg surprisingly have their own relationship too, right? We've had them as a trade partner. It did not go well for the Rangers or for the Blues the last time. St. Louis definitely had some really poor luck with some of the prospects that went back. There was always some level of risk, and Stastny was getting on the older side. But I think for the Jets, they definitely got the better end of the deal. You got an elite center, or at least like an elite second-line center in Stastny, who was a big minute muncher for the Jets, a lead on the power play. And so pretty easy to see that Winnipeg really benefited from his inclusion. Now there comes a point where the Blues are kind of in a weird spot. Their roster is not good. The team really hasn't been able to turn things around. Montgomery is trying to get the squad back on track, but, they're not really doing that well. And they probably want to start to turn the roster over a bit. They've got some interesting younger players, but for the most part, a lot of guys are signed either in their primes or, are in their 30s now. And so for the Blues, given that the Central is still wide open, I don't think that they will be looking to sell too much. I think it will be looking to make some moves that are more like the Colton Parayko variety, where you cut a big contract, maybe you kind of work a sweetheart deal with somebody to try and take his salary on. For one, I would personally avoid that if I'm the Jets. Parayko, for me, is very expensive for what you're getting with him. Offensively, I know that he does have some points this year. If you actually look at his offensive profile, though, it doesn't really track that he's a top-end Morrissey type. I think he can certainly score some goals for you because he's got a booming slapper, but I think the predominant thing that you'd be getting out of him is more of his defensive ability. And whether you think that's worth, $6.5 million for like another 5 or 6 years, to me, I just don't see it. I know that he's technically what the Jets would be after, and between him and Ristolainen, I guess Parayko would be more interesting. But the term and stuff is kind of what kills that interest for me almost immediately. Now, talking about term, there are two guys who've sort of been apparently on the outs. Jordan Kyrou and Robert Thomas haven't really been talked about a lot in trade conversations, but their name has popped up every so often. And it's kind of been a thing over the years where, either Thomas or Kyrou could be available if the offer is absolutely crazy, but St. Louis really hasn't been in a big rush to move either of them. Both are signed to good deals. They both have some level of trade protection, and for the Blues, there's just no real incentive to move your prime centers. So if the Jets were to try and go down this avenue, this is where I think you really swing for the fences with a blockbuster trade. I think if I had a preference, I'd personally have maybe more interest in Thomas. Both are really good options, though. Kyrou might be a little more available. I don't know. The fan base, I think it was earlier this season, was booing him at some point, and he didn't exactly take kindly to it, so maybe he'd appreciate a change of scenery. I know that wasn't really something within his control, but I think for the Blues, they're trying to figure out something, whether this team is ready for the future or if it kind of needs to be overhauled, and moving either of Thomas or Kyrou would probably kickstart your rebuild. This would be a massive, tremendous move. You are talking about two very good top six centers, both of whom are generally pretty decent in shot share, about 50-50, I would say, at 5v5, which is all right. But I think when you consider how bad the Blues have been the past couple of years, both are around a point per game or in the past have been over a point per game. They'd immediately become one of Winnipeg's most centers or most talented centers, whichever one would come to the Jets. And I think Winnipeg would be pretty thrilled with their performance either way. Now, the price is probably, going to be pretty hefty. Kyrou is like 26, Thomas is 25. You are not getting a big center for like $8 million without giving up something pretty significant, especially when you are a division rival and you're talking about guys who are generally more on the positive side of St. Louis's ledger for offensive creation. And again, you have to consider that the Blues are pretty bad. So for either of these guys to be particularly great, I think speaks volumes about their individual talents, even if the numbers may not immediately jump off the page. So for me, I don't really know how this package would work. I don't know that the Blues are even all that interested in moving either of them, but if they are, I would definitely be calling. Winnipeg would probably have its shadow 1C. I know that Scheifele has that role right now, but if you bring in either of Thomas or Kyrou, that's probably the closest that you're going to start getting towards that upgrade. But for the Jets, in their pecking order, probably being used as your 2C. Lowry goes back to your third. The cap situation gets a little tricky in the future years, but if you are already kind of thinking about moving on from an Ehlers or something, this is probably where a lot of his contract cap space gets used up. So for the price, I in terms of the cap hit, it's perfectly reasonable. The cap's going up anyways. I don't worry about the proportion of the cap being used. I do wonder about the trade assets that it would take. It'd be, a hefty package. Like I said with Lafreniere, you're talking Lambert, Perfetti, etc., being included in a mega package, and it still may not be enough. But if the Blues are really trying to shake something up and overhaul this team, I could see either of Kyrou or Thomas being potentially available. I just hope that the Jets don't do the obvious thing and go for Parayko. I know Marcy looked good with him. I just know that, given his foot speed and sort of what his game is, the value that you're going to get out of him is probably not worth it. It'd be one thing if he was like $2 million less, maybe, a couple of years left and not 6+. That's scary for me. That big term, big price tag for a guy who's probably, third pairing more in total impact just doesn't really seem worth it. But either of Thomas or Kyrou, very different story. The other guy you could ask about is Pavel Buchnevich, but I can't really see him moving. I think the Blues would like to move him. I just don't think a guy with a full no trade clause who's signed for the foreseeable future and at 29 years old, I don't really think he's likely to move. I could be wrong about that, but I have a hard time seeing it. If I have some level of interest in some of the players who are perhaps cheaper on the cap hits but have done really well since moving to St. Louis, Dylan Holloway would be one of my most coveted targets. I think he's probably not likely to move, and maybe that's why Kyrou or Thomas could become expendable. Maybe they think Holloway is going to be one of their replacements, and they'd be looking to get a bit younger and cut some of that salary off. But if Holloway would be available, I would be very into the Jets asking what his price tag might be. But he's an RFA, 23. He's got another year at 2.3-ish million. I would be shocked if he's available. I think the Blues brought him in with the expectation he'd become a core part of the team, both in the present and future. And I really don't think that there's been any real change in how they perceive him. So I think he's going to be a good player for them for the foreseeable future, and can't really imagine that they are looking to make a change there at all. But maybe, the Blues feel differently. Maybe there's, a surprise here in store that I haven't seen coming. St. Louis is in a weird position, and it's not always easy to figure out how their front office views things. What I would sometimes suggest, they often go in very different directions. Every now and again, it works for them really nicely. Every now and again, it also really backfires. So, interesting team, very strange position that they are in, and all I can say is good luck, Blues fans. They're shopping Braden Shen, so they do understand that they want to change some things, but you've got to actually move some players that people really want. One last guy that I was kind of thinking about, sort of in the same vein, I thought it'd be worth revisiting the Elias Pettersson conversation. I know Pettersson is not going to be popular, and I wonder if, his perceived value is now so low, at least league-wide, that it actually makes it almost a no-brainer to trade for him. We'll chat about that in just a brief moment. Hey friends, welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about, the very complicated fantasy trade market, players that really aren't available, and that are probably not really in Winnipeg's trade docket, I would say. But if Winnipeg was swinging for the fences, could be in your short list of guys that you would go after. Chief among one of these targets is a player I've talked about before. It always gets a mixed reaction because I think he's seen as soft and sort of malleable and really weak compared to a lot of the other top-end elite centers or something. But Elias Pettersson out there, he had a very quiet tournament for Sweden in this Four Nations face-off. It seems like whatever is going on with him, at least psychologically, is not likely to improve staying in Vancouver. I think the Canucks would really prefer to have him wait and see what happens. I think his own preference is to hang around and see if things can start to improve. But Pettersson at some point is going to have to start delivering some real results. And if he doesn't, I kind of wonder if Vancouver gets ready to move on from him. It's crazy to say that about a guy whose career pace is at like 450 points and just under a point per game. You really don't see players of his caliber ever become available. You usually sign them for the foreseeable future and make them career players or as close to it as it gets. And Pettersson being potentially on the chopping block for me is personally one of the more insane storylines from this past season, and certainly from this year as well. Pettersson has really been popping up in more trade rumors over the past couple of seasons, and if he really is on the market, for me, the Jets really would be crazy not to at least inquire what the price is. Vancouver would probably be looking for Perfetti, Lowry, plus, etc. And, the Jets probably don't have that much interest in making a move like that. Me personally, Pettersson would immediately be one of the most skilled players to have ever, graced the ice for Winnipeg. I know that his numbers this year don't look great, but I promise you the guy who put up like 100 points 2 years ago and was still over a point per game last season if he finds the right environment that's more supportive, if he finds a place where he can really be himself without having to deal with some of the crazy pressures that something like Vancouver can often put guys into, and maybe, away from some of the really bad coworkers that he's had in the past, he might really thrive. The Jets power play would, I'm sure, adore him. I really can't see a reason for him not to work out for Winnipeg. I think at an even strength, he'd be a huge difference maker. He, for me, is one of the most exciting players out there. I know that there are a lot of reasons why people will say you shouldn't go for him. He's too expensive. His numbers are all over the place. The thing with him is that he's a career play driver and an elite scorer, one of the most talented finishers in the NHL, and him having a confidence misfire this year just feels like something that I personally don't want to read too much into. I think his season this year compared to previous years, definitely having a down year. I think partly, maybe the way that Tocchet is coaching this team and having them play doesn't really suit his style. But there was also a lot of locker room drama. The JT Miller thing was not exactly private. And from the rumors about what Miller said to him and what the blow-up was about, I could see it really being a thing that Pettersson took really personally. But if you get him out of there, you get him to a good team like the Jets where everyone's really well connected, people are close, it's a supportive, connected environment. I feel like the version of Pettersson that really wowed fans years ago is going to start to come around again. He's only 26. He's an elite center. He is not cheap in terms of cap hit, but you have to understand that when that deal was signed, he was their franchise center, and I still believe that he can be. I'm just not sure it's going to be in Vancouver. If the Canucks do trade him, Winnipeg should really be taking a close look at what it would potentially cost to bring him in. Again, Winnipeg really hasn't had a player of his caliber at center in probably decades. The closest that you would get is when Scheifele went on that absolute unholy bender, I think probably around, what was it, the World Cup of Hockey year, back when he was still driving play at a level that, was far and above most centers in the entire NHL. That's the kind of player that I think Elias would be. And I think he also has a surprisingly underappreciated defensive game. He's smart like Pistachios, and I think that often allows him to make and force turnovers in ways that people, really aren't expecting from a guy who is predominantly known for being a great shooter. So for me, Pettersson would be a dream-like scenario. I don't really see it happening. I don't think the Canucks are really eager to trade him. But if this situation doesn't improve by the summer or beyond, I do think that Vancouver starts checking into its options. $11.5 million is not chump change. And if Pettersson's numbers don't, start to tick up, I don't think that they'll feel all that bad about trying to move him. So something for the Jets to consider. If you're looking for a 1C and you know that you are going to struggle to draft one, you might as well trade for one. And this could be a way to address that if everything goes right. But it's a big, big, big swing. It has a lot of risk. But if you're the Jets, risk is kind of up your alley at this point. Winnipeg has played it safe for many years, hasn't really worked out. Maybe it's time to go for the biggest chimichanga of all and see if you can turn it into a gold mine. But curious to know how you feel about all these trade targets. Is Lafreniere of interest to you? What do you think about Thomas or Kyrou? Are you still on the Parayko train? Or is Pettersson perhaps somebody that you think the Jets might be able to get a trade for at a value that's not crazy? Let me know in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, so see you then. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.